Headlights cut the night into a thin, trembling line. The storm outside the truck's windshield was more white noise than world, snow like old letters, blurring everything into sameness, until a shape at the side of the road broke that sameness and sat, small and shivered, under the halo of hazard lights. Jackson Ryder eased the truck to the shoulder, killed the engine so the cab would be quiet, and watched the boy he didn't know breathe into his gloves as if trying to warm the cold out of his lungs. He had been driving because he had to keep moving. The miles after Daniel were like a braided rope of obligations and silence. The ranch, the repairs, the calls he returned in half answers, the evenings that were loud with nothing. Daniel's studio, with its stubborn windows and paint-splattered floor, held the echo of a life he refused to throw away. The coffee mug with Daniel's lipstick mark was still in the sink. The brushes lay like bones on a table. Jackson kept them because he'd promised once, foolishly sure, that some of him would move through time with Daniel's things. He didn't expect the promise to be a map. The boy at the road was the sort of fragility Jackson had learned to recognize and to shelter. 21st winter taught a man to notice where the world left room for damage. He popped the truck door, and the cold slapped him awake. The boy stood when Jackson reached him, boots leaving a small, irregular rhythm in the snow. He was young enough for the cage of his ribs to show through his jacket. A thin scarf had been knotted too tight. His eyes were the color of river glass when winter had washed it clean. He looked like someone who had been taught to be invisible and was exhausted from the practice. "You okay?" Jackson asked with a voice that had been used for late-night calls and bartering price lists and saying his name into answering machines that would never answer back. It came out softer than he expected. The boy's lips moved. "My dad left me. Said I should find somewhere to sleep. Said there's nothing here for me." His voice was small and close. He wrapped his arms around himself as if to hold his own heat. Jackson blinked like the word was a physical thing. There had been plenty of stories at his door. Men who had run, women who'd been caught between what was expected and what they wanted. This wasn't the first time someone had been left under a sky that had stopped pretending to be safe. But the particular pang that hit him, this was new. It went sharp straight through the shelter of Daniel's absence, and then someone else's newness softened it to a handhold. "Come on, get in," he said. The truck's heater hummed uncertainly, but it was better than the wind. He wrapped the boy in a thrift store blanket he kept behind the seat for winter work. The kid shivered less when Jackson's bulk was there, like the outline of solid matter made the world hold together. Jackson learned the boy's name on the way home, Finn Holloway. The name fit him. Thin, springing, full of potential, but there was an edge to it, like a used knife set. Finn's hands were stained with something that, when Jackson saw under the light, turned out to be charcoal smudges. He had a sketchbook tucked under his arm. Daniel's studio smelled the way a house remembers someone. Turpentine, old coffee, sun-warmed canvases. Jackson led Finn inside like it was a small, sacred thing he had no right to share, and watched as the boy's eyes widened at the easel and the paint tubes, at the way light pooled on the wooden floorboards. Jackson had never been much for art. He understood cattle and fence lines and how to keep a truck running through a blizzard. But he knew the look of someone who had found their belonging. "You can crash in here for a while," he said. "There's a cot. You can use the heater." Finn nodded. He moved like he didn't want to disturb anything, as if touching Daniel's things could unstick a memory or rearrange guilt. Jackson didn't try to explain. He brought stew, a pot of it, thick with root vegetables and stew meat, the sort of food that asked only to be eaten and warmed, and a mug he'd washed. When Finn took the mug, his hands trembled. Jackson caught himself holding his breath, as if he'd been waiting for a crack to open. They spoke in small things at first, where Finn had come from, what he hoped to do with his life, whether he needed to call anyone. Finn said his father was on a truck route that ran out of county, and when the words came, there was no drama so much as the flat, hard truth of someone who had been given up like cast-off clothing. He would be 21 next week. He'd had a scholarship letter in his pocket once. It had ripped, he said, like a bandage. Jackson listened. He fed him. He brought out the extra flannel shirt his sister had given him and tacked the sleeves just enough to show an availability to small tendernesses. Finn slept on the cot and woke with paint on his fingers like a secret greeting. For Jackson, the night folded in on itself and made a new, small shape of ordinary compassion. They lived in the quiet gravity of that first week. The rhythm of the house moved around the rituals Jackson performed to stay tethered to the world, feeding the horses at dawn, cleaning out the gutters, setting aside groceries to bring to neighbors. Finn learned the sound of Jackson moving in the morning, the way he whistled while he worked, and hummed when he was thinking. Finn learned where Daniel's brushes were kept and how to set them down so they didn't smear. He took to sitting in the studio, chin tucked into a scarf, drawing faces, as if the motion would fix something that neither of them could name. Sheriff Miller came with a pot of soup and a no-nonsense look, and stayed because old loyalties don't always die with a badge. They learned to hide their newness because there was no other place to put it safely. The world, as far as they could see, had corners that would sharpen if something vulnerable stood too tall. One spring night, after the college showcase, and after Jackson closed the barn with his hands smelling of hay and oil, Finn stood in Daniel's studio with a small canvas in his hands. It was a portrait, a study in light, a brushstroke that made Jackson's jaw go slack because it managed, with a few strokes, to hold the way Jackson carried himself when he thought no one saw. "That's you," Finn said. His voice was the kind that kept itself exact on purpose. He didn't ask for permission to be brave. He just asked the world to receive the truth. Jackson felt something in his chest that felt like Daniel and like new breath all at once. He looked to the easel, where Daniel's unfinished landscapes leaned, and felt as if time had folded, tying the past to the present in a small, forgiving knot. "We can't make a spectacle of it," Finn said, after a pause, as if answering questions Jackson hadn't voiced. I don't want us to be risked by other people." Jackson thought about the life he had known, the slow, patient way it had been built against the world's tendencies to divide and condemn. He thought about the small kindnesses he owed to himself and to Finn alike. "We keep it between us," he said, and said it with the steadiness of someone who had learned the value of protecting a fragile thing. That decision was practical and careful and tender. They moved through years with it like a map folded to show only the roads they trusted. Farm work, art shows under low lights, quiet Saturdays at the swap meet where Finn sold small prints, dinners with Sheriff Miller and his wife when the town needed reasons to be kind. They were visible in what mattered, Finn's work, Jackson's farm, but private in what kept them safe. They designed their secrecy not out of shame, but to buy time. Time for Jackson to process grief without a new public to perform it for. Time for Finn to grow into himself without a hometown press conference. Time for both of them to decide when and whether the world could be trusted with the shape of their lives. The years changed the small things. Finn got a studio space in town. Jackson bought a new refrigerator. Finn's hands became steadier. His paintings earned small praise in regional reviews. He sent work to galleries in the next county over. They marked anniversaries not with grand declarations, but with small rituals. Jackson would fix the leaky faucet, and Finn would bring a slice of Daniel's favorite cake recipe, and they'd stand awkward and tender like newlyweds patching a roof. They told few people. Rivera knew the truth. Sheriff Miller knew. A handful of neighbors who loved them for reasons that had nothing to do with gossip learned to accept what was there and to look away when discretion mattered. It felt like a secret because it was. The reasons were practical. This town still had tongues that cut. There were people who equated love with hazard. Jackson had been deputy enough to know what that hazard did. Keeping the rhythm of their lives under a shroud felt less like hiding and more like shelter. If you or someone you know needs help, check the links in the description for local LGBTQ+ resources. There are places that can offer support and shelter, people who have carried others into safer spaces before. Time made them stubbornly ordinary. Finn came home late from figure drawing with his coat smelling of charcoal and a grin. Jackson would wait for the porch light, and he would watch that grin arrive, small and steady, and notice how his own breath changed in his chest when Finn's hand found his. They kept an unspoken trail for one another, an agreed secrecy that gave shape to their days in a world that didn't always make room for what they had. Everything felt fragile in the way a new garden feels fragile. You know starlings can come and wreck it, you know drought can take hold, but if you don't plant anything, you never eat the fruit. Jackson and Finn planted. They were careful with their watering. Then the photograph happened. It wasn't a single moment of conspicuous violation as in the movies, no flashbulbs, no screaming headlines at once. It began at the town's small winter arts fair, the one held in the donated gymnasium at St. Hilda's. The event was flavored with chili and hand-knitted scarves, and Finn had been asked to install a small display, a collection that paired Daniel's unfinished pieces with Finn's newer paintings, a gesture both homage and conversation. Rivera had suggested it, gently insisting that there was value in showing how grief and emergence could occupy the same room. Jackson had come in because he wanted to help hang the heavier canvases. He had the ink of work on his hands and a sweater with a small patch at the elbow. Finn moved between the hanging lights and the crowd, smile careful, hands steady. They had agreed beforehand that the opening would be a small thing, a show more of friends than a public proclamation. They had agreed to keep the private pieces private. Finn had insisted on that, and the gallery agreed. At the opening, a young woman who volunteered for the Arts Council circulated with a camera. She took images for the newsletter. She took their hands together when they were arranging a photograph by the easel, because it was easy to think that a man with a weathered jaw and a young artist together made a human interest photo that would make the newsletter pop. The woman was used to snapping quick portraits. She loved the warmth of domesticity in art. She didn't think to ask for permission, because in a town that had folded them into kindness, that was sometimes how the mistakes had happened. An assumption that the small circle you belonged to would translate easily beyond itself. The image was tender. Jackson's hand resting where Finn's shoulder met his neck. Finn's face turned toward Jackson with a private laugh mid-escape. It could have been an image of an uncle at his nephew's art opening. It could have been a photograph of two friends. It read a different way depending on the eye that looked at it. The volunteer posted the image to the town's Facebook page with a caption that didn't think about consequences. A simple, "Loved seeing our community come together, especially this moment between two local favorites." Someone with a large following, a blogger who wrote about the town, who had once written a profile about the ranch and the old deputy who fixed fences, saw the picture. The blogger, hunting for a human angle on a bland midwinter fare, reposted it with a clipped aside. "Unexpected romance spotted at the arts fair. Hearts warmed. More to come." The words were small and careless, but the repost pushed the photograph beyond the comfortable bubble of the arts page and into a current that moved quickly. A cousin in the coffee shop recognized the two men. Someone who was not kind, or who had been waiting for an opportunity to stir trouble, took a screenshot and posted it to a local conservative group with a caption that invited speculation. From there, it spread. Shared, commented on, reshared. It slipped out of slow coffee shop gossip into message threads with people who used the anonymity to sharpen their tongues. The photograph stayed the same. Everything else around it changed. The leak felt like a breach of muscle. Jackson found out because Sheriff Miller called him at 5 a.m., voice low and careful, like he was calling to warn him about a rolling storm. "You seen this?" Miller asked. The screen on Jackson's phone lit up with the same image Finn had believed would stay within the gallery's quiet. The comments looped like a refrain, supportive notes, but also barbs, the old town tendencies folding into it. Someone had dug up an old photo of Jackson in uniform and set it alongside this, as if to force a narrative. former deputy, now in a relationship that the town might have opinions about. Finn found the photograph on his feed, the phone buzzing like a hive. He turned it off and looked at Jackson with the look of someone whose small room of safety had been invaded. "They took it without asking," he said. The words were raw and close. There was no theater in the complaint. It was just the simple statement of property violated. Jackson's first instinct was protective, the same angle that had led him to pull Finn out of the storm in the first place. His second instinct, older and heavier, was to build a wall. He could see how the town might twist things. He could see how his standing as an ex-deputy might complicate Finn's life. He could also see how fragile Finn was, the kid who had been left on a roadside and who had learned what it meant to be an object in someone else's story. He took the phone and set it on the table like a bomb that needed to be diffused with careful hands. They did not confront the woman who'd taken the photo immediately. They went to Rivera, who listened and then sat on the arm of a chair, elbows on knees, and said plainly, "You can sue for distribution without consent. We can ask the page to take it down, but we also need to prepare." Miller called in favors, an attorney friend who volunteered advice pro bono, a civil rights contact in the next county who'd taught workshops on social media privacy. Finn's college friends rallied, many writing public notes of support and petitioning the pages to remove the photo. The town felt suddenly divided along lines that were both familiar and new. Some of Jackson's neighbors texted notes that were warm and private. One of the feed's most vocal commenters, someone who had once been a patron of the farm's annual feed giveaway, wrote something cold and hairline cruel. Robert Holloway, Finn's father, appeared in the margins like bad weather. He had been a shadow in the early months, vague in returning phone calls and refusing support. Now he called the morning talk show with a complaint about Jackson influencing his son, implying in clipped sentences that Jackson had hooked Finn and used him, a line that hurt not because it was true, but because it forced Finn to stand next to the man who had abandoned him and be judged by the bruised measure of his father's words. Robert's voice on the radio was small-town performative rage, theatrical in the way people who felt empty sometimes sounded. But his words were not harmless. They fed the narrative for those who wished to see scandal. Jackson listened to a click of the radio and thought of the small, careful ways he had learned. He thought of Daniel, who had once sat up all night with a broken friend and never meant the acts of care to become headlines. He felt the old ache and then something new, a stubbornness that would not be dismantled. They were forced into responses they had avoided by choice. Finn pressed charges against the page for spreading the image without consent, citing invasion of privacy. The lawyer argued restraint would help. The Arts Council apologized for the volunteer's assumption and promised new consent forms for photographs at events. The volunteer who took the photo, Emma, was not the villain in the sense the headlines wanted. She was young, flustered, and remorseful in a way that did not absolve her. She sent them an email, hands shaking through her typing, and asked to meet. Emma's apology was genuine. Her eyes filled when she stood in front of Jackson and Finn in Daniel's studio and said, "I never meant to hurt you." She had expected a thank you for the piece in the newsletter. When Finn accepted her apology and asked for support to get the image taken down, she handed over the original file and cooperated with the removal requests. Emma's apology was genuine. Her eyes filled when she stood in front of Jackson and Finn in Daniel's studio and said, "I never meant to hurt you." She had expected a thank you for the piece in the newsletter. When Finn accepted her apology and asked for support to get the image taken down, she handed over the original file and cooperated with the removal requests. But the internet is porous. Copies echoed in comment threads, and the story had already seeded itself beyond a single post. The backlash took forms both expected and insidious. There were letters to the editor, a few cold looks at the feed store, and a rumor that the town council might rescind Jackson's volunteer position with the VFW youth outreach because of community concerns. The VFW had always been a touchstone for Jackson's patience with those who'd not loved well. The idea of losing that work felt like a small theft. Anonymous calls to the college asked whether Finn's art classes were part of a pattern. Finn received one hateful voicemail, short and cruel. The way the leak threaded through the town was also the way small-town life could be vindictive toward anyone who didn't conform. Yet, for every voice that hissed, a quieter, steadier chorus rose. Sheriff Miller stood by them like a pillar. At the county station, he called the talk radio host and corrected the record. Rivera penned a calm op-ed about consent and the way art can be misread by those looking for scandal. Finn's professor friends from the college wrote letters, spoke on panels, and used their own platforms to reframe the narrative as a conversation about privacy and the dignity of living honestly. The local shelter, which had once been the place Jackson had been told to call and had found wary help in, posted resources and a statement about dignity and safety. There came a time when silence was no longer a shelter, but a cage. The online threads grew like mold, persistent, spreading, hardening into accusation for those who wanted it. The town council called for a public meeting at the community hall after someone filed a complaint suggesting that the photograph indicated impropriety and that the town needed to weigh in. The meeting would be a place of contention or of grace. It felt, to Jackson, like the narrow corridor before a door that you had to walk through together. That night, the hall smelled of coffee and old cloth chairs. People were arranged in a semicircle. Some faces were warm, some carried the coolness of curiosity. Finn and Jackson walked in together, one step between them that felt like the width of a world, and sat beneath the bright, unforgiving lights. Someone had set up a small table for public comment. Jackson's hands were folded, Finn's knee brushed his. Robert Holloway arrived as well, eyes a little red, the sort of man who had learned to be loud when he felt small. He read a prepared statement about parental rights and exposure, an attempt to stitch guilt into a legal garment and throw it on both of them. Jackson felt the old impulse to meet fire with fire. Instead, he looked at Finn and thought how small his shoulders seemed under the fluorescent lights. He rose when it was his turn. "I'm not the man I was 10 years ago," he said. His voice carried through the hall, not loud, but steady as a hammer blow. He spoke of the rescue on a winter night, of the pot of stew, of the things he'd learned about care, about what it meant to keep someone safe. He spoke of Daniel, because to erase him in the service of a tidy narrative would be a lie. He said, "We kept our lives private because we wanted to protect what we had, not because we were ashamed." He did not demand perfect votes of confidence from the people there. He asked only for the space to live without forced spectacle. Finn spoke after him. He read from a small piece of paper that looked like something someone had told him to put into a script, but the words were true. He spoke of the cold on the roadside the night Jackson found him. He spoke of being soft in a hard place and of the dignity he had found in being known by someone who stayed. He did not shame his father. He said simply, "My father left. I don't want his being loud to define my life." The meeting did not resolve the town's divisions. Some voices remained sharp, asserting their own discomfort. Others nodded. Shame at their own reflexes flushed briefly over their cheeks. There were still people who would write cruel comments on the town page. But the hall, after Jackson and Finn's words, felt differently. The quick click of phones had slowed. Sheriff Miller, seated near the back, stood and read a statement on policy. The county would follow privacy law in matters of social media distribution. The VFW announced it would review any policies that might have been threatened by rumor. Rivera invited the Arts Council to sponsor a small panel on consent at future events. The public moment changed the tenor of rumor into something that could be argued and, more importantly, something that could be corrected. The legal pressure and the organized support forced the pages that had hosted the photo to issue corrections and to remove private copies where they could. The volunteer who'd taken it began a campaign in the Arts Council to implement clear consent protocols for photography at events, training that included language on consent and respect. Emma, the volunteer, ran the first workshop, voice thick, saying, "I learned the hard way, you can't assume you know someone's story." Her apology was not a shield for the harm done, but it became part of a practical response. The aftermath was still messy. There were lost friendships, uncomfortable conversations, defensive letters. Robert Holloway's name was in the press for calling about his son with a kind of performative outrage that pretended to be concern. But there were also people who came forward quietly and said they were sorry. A neighbor that had been cool to Jackson for years left a basket of pies at his doorstep with a note, "We don't always understand. We choose to learn." It wasn't perfection. Nothing about their life was a straight, triumphant arc, but it was real. The crisis pulled into the light something they had hidden, and then it forced the town to reckon with questions that had been easier to ignore when those things stayed behind closed doors. It became a teachable, if messy, moment about how community either makes room for its members or chooses to outcast them. Finn's art, which had been folded up in the safety of the studio, began to be seen for what it had always been, a conversation between past and future. A modest exhibition was organized in the months that followed, a show that paired Daniel's unfinished landscapes with Finn's new pieces. It was not billed as a reveal, but as a conversation. Rivera curated it with a steady eye and a respect that felt like mending. The opening had fewer people than the arts fair, but it included those whose presence mattered. Sheriff Miller, who wrote an essay about the obligations of small towns to protect privacy, members from the local shelter who set up a donation table, and a small group of Finn's peers from college. Jackson came to the opening with a coat that showed hay flecks in the shoulder and a knuckled hand that had learned to build more than guard. Finn led him through, and when he stood in front of a portrait Finn had painted of Jackson, because Finn had painted more than one, the room felt like it held its breath. The portrait was honest. It didn't glamorize Jackson into something he wasn't. It showed the way he squared his jaw when he'd had to be brave, and it showed the gentleness he wore around Finn like a work glove. People who had once whispered found themselves reading the placards that explained consent and the care that had gone into curating the show. A local reporter, whose initial impulse had been to snatch for headlines, wrote a piece that was more thoughtful, an exploration of what privacy meant in a town that had long fed on the spectacle of neighbors' lives. The revelation of the photo had consequences. A few hands had been forced into apology, policies had been rewritten, a small, steady network of support had rearranged itself into something practical. A fund was set up to donate to youth shelters in the county. Finn and Jackson donated a portion of the sales from the show. They started a program with the shelter and Rivera's college for an art workshop for teenagers, a place where young people could learn brushwork and, more importantly, learn to tell their own stories in ways that protected them or taught them how to ask for protection. They arranged for supply boxes along the county roadsides, warmed with blankets and art kits, a small thing that said, "We saw you and we will not let you be alone." Not all the tenderness in their town had been won. There were still nights when Jackson left a back door open and stood with his silhouette in the frame to test the air. There were days when Finn would get a cold note from a relative that felt like frost. Healing, they learned, was not linear. It was a stubborn, gradual work. But their relationship, which had begun in a truck with blankets and stew, had become a modest action for action. Daniel's memory was never erased. His studio remained a chapel of paint and sunlight. Finn left a corner of one wall for Daniel's unfinished landscapes, a small plaque with Daniel's name and dates. Jackson, who still sometimes woke certain nights expecting to find Daniel at the edge of the bed, found that when he looked to the studio, he saw Daniel's presence like a weather pattern that had shifted, no longer a storm, but a kind of continuing weather. Finn's portrait of Jackson hung near Daniel's pieces, like a convergence of past and present. The town's new rhythms included occasional tensions and regular acts of small kindness. Sheriff Miller dropped by more often, bringing a ridiculous pie that Finn pretended to dislike but ate anyway. The volunteer who'd taken the photo became an advocate at events, handing out consent forms and teaching others what she'd learned. Robert Holloway and Finn had a few more conversations, awkward, not resolved, but truer for being less performative. Robert's anger softened in some places and hardened in others. He was left to reckon with being a father who had left behind the man he had made. Finn forgave him only in the small increments he could, because forgiveness here was not a grand absolution, but a choice to refuse a life run by bitterness. In the end, the photo had been a breach, a theft, but the way the story unfolded was not the neat drama of a headline. It was instead the slow unscrewing of a hard shell stuffed with prejudice and unhelpful assumptions. It was the making visible of what had been protected for years, a revealing that, for all its cruelty, allowed some people to step forward into their best selves. Allies did more than post statements. They changed procedures, started workshops, donated funds, taught consent, sat in the awkward hall and listened. Spring turned again to the rust of the next winter. They put up a small roadside box near the county line filled with blankets, non-perishable food, and a stack of sketchbooks with a note. If you need warmth or a page to write your days on, take one. Love is here. Finn had hand-lettered the sign. Jackson had built a small shelf beneath it and nailed it in place on the post so it would stand in weather. Children in the town had learned to leave painted stones there, tiny guardians of care. The box was modest, but it mattered. A year after the photograph, Rivera arranged a small exhibition across the county that celebrated creating through grief. Finn submitted a large canvas, a portrait that held Jackson like light. It was a private thing in public, and people stood before it, some with teary eyes and others with the kind of quietly impressed silence that follows something honestly held. Jackson stood in the back, hands in the pockets of a coat that smelled faintly of hay, and when Finn stepped toward him and took his hand, the brush strokes of the portrait seemed to warm the room. They were seen that night, seen not as a scandal, but as a human story, with faults and tenderness. Across town, a few people still argued that some line had been crossed. On the porch of the farmhouse, as snow began like an old forgiveness, Finn and Jackson stood with two mugs that steamed and looked out over the fields. The air was thin and sharp, and it made everything bright. "You could have done without all this," Finn said softly, not accusing, but recognizing a truth. Jackson looked at him. "I could have," he agreed, "but then you'd still be out there. You'd still have had to fight the cold without a blanket someone made you find." Finn leaned his head on Jackson's shoulder in that ordinary, clean way that belonged to them. They let the quiet live between them. Neither grandly announced victory nor claimed perfection. They had been seen, and being seen had consequences. There were days when the press called and times when the county remembered them as that photograph. But more often, they were remembered for the potlucks Jackson organized at the shelter, for the art kids who came by the studio and left with paint-stained fingers, for the little hand-painted stones at the roadside box, for the way Jackson greeted his neighbors now, with a gentle pride instead of a guarded silence. In the studio, a new painting hung beside Daniel's last landscapes, Finn's painting of Jackson in the light of the barn's end of day. It was not a protest nor a banner. It was a portrait that said, in color and line, that people could survive being seen. People could continue to make a life after privacy had been breached. It was testament that love, quiet, stubborn, sheltered for safety, then offered back to the world, did not dissolve under the glare. It changed shape and asked for different kinds of courage. At the next community meeting, when someone questioned whether showing vulnerability was a risk one ought to take, Sheriff Miller answered in a way that felt like the town decided to keep learning rather than to freeze. If you shelter everyone you love, he said, they never get a chance to stand up and speak for themselves. That doesn't mean you throw them into the wind. It means you teach the town to stop making wind out of every private thing. The photograph that had once threatened to undo them became slowly a cornerstone for outreach. People learned to ask for consent at events. The shelter's youth program grew a small art therapy module that found funding. Finn's paintings went to shows where his voice, willing now to be careful but public, connected with people who had been young and lost once. Daniel's name lived on as well, not as the erasure of something new, but as the honored memory that held room for change. Their romance had stayed hidden for years because they had wanted to protect themselves from a world not always ready to hold what they had. When a photograph exposed everything, it forced the town to step forward into a hard, necessary conversation about privacy, consent, and what we owe one another when we live in close spaces. The photograph was not an ending. It was a moment that fractured something into pieces that could be reassembled with more care. On a porch that smelled of old coffee and pine, Finn drew a small house by hand on a napkin and handed it to Jackson. "Our address," he said with a half grin. Jackson traced the little house with the pad of his thumb. "We'll add a porch light," he said, "and more blankets." They laughed, small, the kind of sound that had lived in the warm corners of their home for years. They held hands in a way that was no longer a furtive thing, but a public tenderness, not a spectacle, just two people living carefully and honestly. If this story moved you, consider supporting local youth shelters or art programs in your area. Share stories that honor chosen families and respect the dignity of people who have survived being left behind. There are links below to organizations doing real work. Even a small act, donating time, a box of art supplies, a warm blanket, changes the story for someone who needs it.